Thank you for tuning in to Season 1 of the Movie Geeks United Art of the Documentary series. In this episode, we speak with documentary filmmaker Doug Block, whose films include the beautiful 51 Birch Street, Home Page, The Kids Grow Up, and 112 Weddings. For a complete listing of the new and archived interviews that make up Season 1 of this series, visit us online at moviegeeksunited.net.
I guess my first question to you is how you came to documentaries or how they came to you.
They came to me through seeing a documentary called Sherman's March in 1985. I grew up not particularly liking documentaries. They were pretty much, forced on us in school growing up. The nature documentaries, the ones with the voice of God narrating, usually pretty dull, and I didn't have much feeling one way or the other for them. I just never really remember enjoying any of them, and always wanted to be a real filmmaker, making real films. Because I was a real cinephile from probably the age of 16 on. And then in 85, I remember reading about this film, and I went to the Bleecker Street Cinema. It was packed with people, and it was just hugely entertaining and funny and serious, and most of all, came from a real director's vision, much like a good fictional film would do. And I realized that, instantaneously I realized the potential of documentaries. And then I kind of accidentally fell into making them myself.
Do you feel like, because that's not an uncommon perception of the documentary form, especially many years ago, but culturally, do you feel like that perception has changed in recent years, that documentaries aren't necessarily looked upon as, something akin to vegetables, like, they're necessary because they're good for you kind of thing?
Yes. I absolutely. I mean, I think there's been a sea change in the last 20, 30 years. I think, I think reality TV has helped. Not that I think it's like, bears as much, doesn't bear a lot of relationship to pure documentary, but it's certainly, many more people perceive of real life, capturing real life on camera as potentially entertaining. I think documentary filmmakers have been far more aware now of the need to entertain, to tell a story, to bring certain modalities of fiction filmmaking to documentary, everything from story and character arcs to, bigger music scores, to more elaborate, production, shooting, crane shots are not uncommon. Tracking shots during interviews aren't uncommon. Right. I'm not advocating for them necessarily, but, I see them all the time in documentaries now. And likewise, interestingly, I think fiction films are adapting modes of documentary now. More and more, you see handheld footage and coverage that's meant to look as realistic as possible. Acting that seems like it's real life or improvisational. So, very interesting how they're blending.
It is, and I find that there's certain artists that are really testing the boundaries of the documentary form. Is there a certain point, I asked this of Brett Morgan, because he employs a lot of kind of cinematic techniques in the work that he does. Is there a certain point when you're in danger of not adhering to the documentary form?
Well, it depends on your definition of the documentary form, which is very fluid. I mean, that's what's so interesting. Is I love films that question: is this documentary or not? I like those films that sort of are what we call hybrids. And take elements of fiction film and put them into documentary. or have revelations that make you question everything that you've seen before that. And is it really true? I mean, there's more and more reenactments now. I'd be hard pressed to answer: is there a pure documentary form? A lot of critics, a lot of people look at documentaries as if they should be objective, whatever that means.
Right. Right.
So I mean, it's interesting for discussion, but
well, I guess that's the nature of my question. I mean, are the general rules of documentary filmmaking, are they more similar to narrative than we suspect? I mean, are the guidelines ultimately to entertain and tell as clean a narrative as possible?
No, I mean, I think I would put rules in quotation marks, but generally speaking, with documentary, you don't interfere with the events. Mm-hmm. That you allow them to play out on camera. Without the director or writer or whoever behind the camera, telling people what to say and do. Does that get violated at times? I'm sure it does. Do people bend chronology? Of course they do. There's all sorts of things that are, liberties that are taken in the editing room in the service of telling a more powerful or entertaining story. But I think a big difference is in the approach and in the production and shooting. So, I mean, I think that's.
How often do you feel yourself navigating that line? I mean, is that kind of a constant mindset that you have to be in to avoid veering off into those directions that would be better suited for a narrative?
No, for me, it's much more: should I be shooting this or not shooting it? Is this going to get in the way of real life? Particularly when I'm dealing with my family. I mean, some of my films have been about my family, and do I want to interfere? Or do I want to ask them to have this be on camera? Is it appropriate to be on camera, or should we just be dealing with this in real life? It's much more that than manipulating anything. I would never tell anybody to say anything or have them redo something because I missed it. I don't do multiple takes ever of anything. So, right. I don't even think of it in terms of, what is an audience going to think about this as I'm shooting it. I am thinking about where does this fit into the general story that I'm trying to tell, or themes that I'm exploring. But with documentary, it's often a matter of you're gathering material. You try and get access and get permission to shoot something that you think might fit, and then later on in the editing, you work it out where it's going to fit or how it's going to fit, and does it even fit at all?
Well, is there always a moment in the process where, that you're uncertain whether or not this is a film? But at a certain point, a light bulb comes on where you say, okay, this is the movie, or the movie itself tells you what it wants to be?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in some occasions it's so much clearer than with others. I've had, when I think back to my films, like most of them have been very clear from the moment I started shooting on them what the film was about. But a couple, I'm really just trying to explore a certain idea. Like my second film, Homepage, was about the early days of the internet, and I was just fascinated by it. I think it was year 3 of the internet. I started shooting in '96 of the web, and I was just fascinated with what people were doing in those early days with personal diaries and what we now call blogs. They didn't have a definition or label then, but it was just people, throwing their personal lives up on the internet in a very kind of daring and experimental way. And I thought, wow, there's something very interesting here. But I didn't quite know what the story was at first, and then, came across what turned out to be my main character, Justin Hall, this kid who had the web's most interesting and influential personal blog, it was just once I met him, I went, okay. Now I see a way as somebody to peg this story on, and to kind of help me navigate my way through this. And with the film I'm making now, it's a much more similar to that. Coming up with an idea, but not quite seeing the story behind the idea, and trusting that in the process of the exploration, you'll come up with a narrative.
You mentioned the word objective earlier, which your films, many of them very much fly in the face of that notion, because they're intensely personal just by the nature of you're following your family through a couple of them. And I just rewatched a 51 Birch Street, and it's just such a gorgeous film.
Thank you.
In terms of putting that together, I have a few questions for you about it. First of all, you're shooting, like I said, a deeply personal story, and kind of like a microcosm of your own family life. When you unleash that upon the world, does it surprise you that it rings more universally than possibly you initially expected it to?
No, not really. I mean, I knew it was a universal story because everybody's parents are a mystery to them. Even when they get older and are perhaps parents themselves, maybe they have a little more sympathy and understanding. But on some level, the central idea behind it was I thought very intriguing, which was like, do you ever really know your parents? And then if you had the opportunity, like I did with, discovering my mother's, years and years of my mother's diaries after she died, would you want to read them? Would you want to know them on that kind of level? I knew I was onto something very universal there, which was the impetus behind doing it. I didn't do it because I thought my family was so fascinating. Quite the opposite. I did it because I was suddenly in this situation that was just so odd, the basic thrust of the story is that, I thought my parents had this wonderful, or at least quite good and compatible 54-year marriage. And about 3 months after my mother died, suddenly and unexpectedly, my father calls from Florida to announce that he's moving in with his secretary from 40 years before. And they marry, they sell the family home out in Long Island, and, that's where I discovered my mother's diaries, literally 2 weeks before the movers came. And that's when I realized that I had a film. I mean, I really wasn't even shooting the film up until then. So the main story takes place in those 2 weeks, and then there's a lot of filling in and interviews around it. But I knew almost immediately once I started shooting that it would be that the move day would be the last of the shooting. That it would end when my father and his new wife left the home that me and my sisters grew up in.
And was there any kind of hesitancy on your father's part, or even your siblings' part, to play a role in this documentary?
No, because they didn't know what I was doing. I'm shooting on something that looks like a camcorder. I've been shooting, here and there, for years and years. Any kind of family event, I'd whip the camera out for like 5-10 minutes, and everybody would go, "Douglas," and then they'd forget about it. And so I don't think it was even that unusual for my father to be showing up with my camera and suddenly asking him some questions. And, at one point I told him, I thought it might make some story and that it would, the situation would resonate with people. And, he knew I made films. This was my, I think, third film. So, and I'd produced others. So, but family, they don't make the connection between seeing you, shooting by yourself on some camcorder-looking device, And, suddenly showing in a theater packed with people. I remember when it premiered at the Toronto Film Festival. One of my sisters, as we were walking down the hallway into the theater for the premiere, she turned to me and just went, "I still don't understand why anybody would possibly be interested in this other than our family." We walk in the door and there's like 450 people packed in the theater, and her eyes just got a little bit wide. And I think, to answer your earlier question, I absolutely knew that this story would ring true universally everywhere. I had total faith in it, and the only question was, could I get out of the way and not fuck it up too badly? What I was a bit surprised by was just how big it got out. I mean, it was a huge hit that year. It played in theaters for 9 months, won a lot of year-end awards. I think, A.O. Scott named it one of his top 10 films of the year, which was a nice surprise. But it played all over the world, and some of the best reviews and feedback and appreciation came in totally unexpected places far around the world. I remember reading, my favorite was actually from a critic in Ecuador that a friend translated for me. And the first line of his review was, 51 Birch Street is everyone's address. And I thought, wow, you cannot get a higher compliment than somebody in a different continent and a different language and culture saying that about your film.
No, that's beautiful. I'm particularly interested in the editing process in that film and other films that you've done, but it's actually articulated by, I believe, the rabbi in 51 Birch Street, who says something like, as a son, would you be interested in reading your mother's diary? Sure, but could I imagine, sharing it with the rest of the world? I'm not sure about that. Was there kind of a constant negotiation in your mind of what to share and what was just too personal?
Oh, I don't think it was. Yeah, I mean, okay. Look, there's some things that are too personal that you may think about and try on and decide, I just don't want to go there. A lot of times, we put things in because it was funny. I remember that line in particular by the rabbi. We felt that the editor Amy Seplin and I want to give editors credit because they contribute so much to documentaries, and generally their contributions are unmentioned or negated somehow, and they're critical to this. We spend a lot of time trying to, set up the fact that it was not easy for me to go into those diaries. That certainly wasn't my instinct. And I had a real sort of ethical quandary about should I or shouldn't I, knowing all the time that the audience is dying for you to do it. But if you do it too quickly or too gleefully, they'll hate you for it. And even if you do it with reservations, it required my mother's friend at the end to kind of say, yes, she would have loved it. Her getting understood by. And having her secrets kind of revealed in this way.
Well, and it did speak to, the filmmaker's role is one of introspection and wanting to learn the nature of what it means to be human. That's what film does for us.
And writing and, art in general, sure.
Yes. So in the process of making that film, I would think that you've established a great feeling of kinship with your mother to discover that she had a lot of that stuff swirling inside of her as well. Yeah, I had a great kinship with my mother and my father. What's interesting about the film, I think, is that, and we went to great lengths to set up that I already had a great kinship with my mother, and not so much with my father. And the challenge of the film was to come around in the course of it to an understanding and appreciation of my father and a new closeness with him without losing sympathy for my mother.
which was hard to do because they were at loggerheads, and had a really difficult marriage, it turns out. That was one of the key revelations of poking into her diaries, was just how much anger and frustration my mother felt with the marriage. So, it's a matter of getting past that kind of mother-son kinship to like an adult appreciation of who my mother was as a woman in her own right, in all of her complexity, because she was not an easy woman, and at the same time, gaining a real profound empathy for my father and what it was like for him raising 3 kids in this new thing called the suburbs after the war.
Yeah. Well, I think with all filmmakers, with most filmmakers, when they make a film, and they reach the end of the road on it, they feel like they have a deeper understanding of something, or they feel, if it went well, they feel somewhat changed or matured by the process. But this must be particularly true of you, because with movies like 51 Birch Street or The Kids Grow Up, or even to a certain extent the 112 Weddings, I mean, you're exploring elements of your own relationships and your own life, and I would think that at the end of that process, you probably, how does that morph your own personal feelings on your relationships?
Oh yeah, well you're constantly growing as a person doing these things, and that's all great. It saves me money on therapy, but I don't ever confuse these films for therapy for myself or for the audience. It's like this isn't therapy. I'm telling a story, and in the process of making it, I'm always thinking about the audience. Always thinking about the audience. I grew up. I didn't go to film school. I learned how to make films by seeing movies. And as a time when you had to go into a movie theater to watch movies, it predated VCRs. Growing up in the basically the 70s were my formative film time. It was a great time for film, for American film and for art cinema the world over. And I just devoured films. And, there's something about growing up seeing films with an audience that makes you very, very aware of how films are received, particularly humor, but mood and how mood is conveyed and how you can transition from something very serious to something very funny, and back again on a dime, and there were some filmmakers who were just masters of that, like Truffaut, for instance. So, when I'm making even these very personal documentaries, I'm, always aware that there's going to be that moment of reckoning down the line where, ideally people come into a theater and the lights dim and the curtain parts and, everything that came before this doesn't matter. It's now like it either works for them as a story or it doesn't work for them. And so, so much of my thinking goes into that, even including working out my role in the film. If I'm, telling the story of this film from a first-person perspective, that doesn't mean I don't have a role in it. I was very aware of my role in both 51 Birch Street and The Kids Grow Up, particularly because, they were more directly about my family. And when I finally start making the film, which, as I said, in 51 Birch Street was a very short, brief, intense period, I was constantly coming back every day, writing in my notebook, like, what is my role? What is the story? What's really going on underneath this story? What is it about? Trying to get at every possible angle and theme of it so that even as I'm shooting, I know what questions to ask. I know what footage to try and get. I realized early on that, my home was essentially a character in the film. That's about leaving home, and the home where I grew up and, getting packed up and moved out of, and in a sense abandoned, and all the emotions that conjures up. So, I made it a point to get shots of the house from just about every angle I possibly could in the street. And it was taking place in the fall, so I even went back a year later and did pickup shots of the leaves on the street and, any view that I hadn't gotten, at the time. So it's always, and I realized my role in that film was to be my mother's defender, and to get my father. I'm going to find out what, did my father and his secretary have anything going on all those years? What was going on there? Was he, cheating on my mom? And so that was, the starting point for me in the film and where I was coming from. And what's great is if you can get to a very, very different place by the end of the film. That's part of the fun of that kind of storytelling.
Well, I know that with narrative filmmakers, say someone like Woody Allen, who's made 50 movies, however many movies he's made.
Yeah.
But when you watch them all, you can see the same kinds of themes popping up. The same thing with someone like Stanley Kubrick, even though he made wildly different genres. There were elements that clearly preoccupied him that he kept returning to. Your own identity as a filmmaker. I mean, do you see those common strands between your works?
That's an interesting question. I'm sure there are some, and I think if I gave it some thought, I'd come up with a few. But I sort of see them as different beasts. That each one sort of its own independent beast that I had to tame. So it would be really interesting. I mean, I absolutely, there are themes of family and relationships and navigating family stories and dramas and relationships from an insider perspective. But I don't know. I mean, I don't tend to work from themes and go out from there.
Well, there's also, I mean, something that I've noticed, the process of transitions. The people in your films are going through really profound periods of transition in their lives. I find, and which is inherently dramatic.
Yeah, but that's storytelling. I mean, that's I gravitate towards interesting stories, and if you look up, the body of work that I've helped produce, the films of others, often, they're not all personal documentaries, but they're all really great stories, and that's that's what I'm attracted to is situations that are inherently dramatic or interesting. With 51 Birch Street, it was this, trying to get at what happened with my parents, with and their relationship before the house, knowing that, as long as we were still in the house, my father was willing to talk, but knowing that as soon as he moved away, I would no longer really be in the environment where this stuff could come out. It seemed like there was a deadline. I had to know, and I had to know right away. And if I didn't find out before the movers came, that was my chance. With the kids grow up, it was basically, I'd been filming with my daughter periodically as she grew up. As I said, when we'd go to family events, I'd whip out the camera for 5-10 minutes. I'd do a bunch of 5-10 minute shooting at various times over the years. We kind of had a fun ritual when she was a kid that I would interview her, and then oftentimes she would interview me. So we do that once a year, but they were short little things, and mostly it was just playing around. But I long felt there was a really, really interesting film to be made from the perspective of a parent over time. I just hadn't seen that in other documentaries. There are plenty of documentaries done from the perspective of the sons and daughters, adult sons and daughters about their parents, whether they're, oftentimes they were famous parents, but not always. But I couldn't think of any film that had been done by a parent about their kid growing up. And so I thought a long time about that, but I couldn't really find a story for it. So years went by, and I'd work on other films and other projects, including 51 Birch Street. Which, by the way, when I first started shooting, I actually tried to kind of force feed it into this film about my daughter, and there was just no way. They were just too different.
Right.
I remember like a specific moment where my daughter had gone to junior year abroad in high school to France, and I was back for her senior year. And I just woke up thinking, oh, my God, in a year she's going to be gone. She was gone last year, but we knew she was coming back. But now she's really going to be gone. And holy crap, where did the time go? That goes fast. And, wow, nobody prepares you for letting them go. And that there's going to be this moment where you just kind of, like, butterfly, letting them, flutter off into the world. And I just went, wow, I think, I saw the story, in that moment. I kind of saw where the story of the film would be her last year at home, and that it would end when we said goodbye to her, sending her off to college, that it was sort of a natural ending. And also that all this footage that I'd shot with her over the years then could be used as memory, that we could go back and forth in time, and suddenly I saw a role for that old footage. So, it's just an interesting process that, it's almost like one moment you're not making a film, and then suddenly a moment later you are making a film, and you almost see it as a whole, complete story.
Yeah.
So I don't think of themes per se. They're not driven by themes. They're just sort of driven by story elements that sort of come together in your mind. Although, by the way, looking back on a common element, almost all of them have to do with time and, time passing and how time impacts, families and relationships. They do seem to have that in common in just about all of my films.
Yeah, and that's an element I love. I think the all-time greatest accomplishment of documentary filmmaking for me personally, kind of from a humanistic standpoint, is the 7 Up series.
I knew you were going to say that, but it's true. It's what documentaries. It's what's so special about documentaries. Boyhood was a really interesting, fantastic film, and the first fiction film that I really saw of where within one film, time passed much like it does in a documentary, with the real people involved, real actors. Before that, it had just been where, somebody like, Richard Linklater would come back with the same actors and pick up a story 10 years later, like the series he did with Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, Before Sunset, I guess.
Right.
Which I thought was great too. But it's so rare in fiction filmmaking. If somebody tried to make a fiction version of The Kids Grow Up, they would have needed 4 actresses of different ages to play Lucy in the film. And if they did a really good job of casting, people would go, wow, those actors, they look so much alike. But they're actors on some level. Yeah. And the thing about documentary is that part of what's fascinating about The Kids Grow Up is when I go back into the past, you see the same kid back in the past, and how she was as a young kid now informs how you see her in the present when you come back to the present day story. Just seeing how they age, and when they grow up, how their bone structure changes and their faces change and their affect changes as they become a teenager. It's it's something that documentary can do so well. And I love films that take advantage of going back into a past and having great home movies where you can you can see the past come to life like that.
Absolutely, and you also kind of can capture shifts in cultural thinking. If you look at 51 Birch Street, there was a certain perception of what marriage was, kind of encapsulated by your parents' relationship.
Yeah.
And then you go to something like 112 Weddings. How do you see in those passing generations how people approach the concept of marriage differently today than they might have back then?
Well, I think there was a much different attitude towards child rearing back then. I think parents were far less stressed about their kids. They just whipped them out, and they just said, "Fend for yourself. You'll be fine." And now, it's so much over-parenting going on, so much concern that everything be just the best for their kids. From the best organic food to the best education they can possibly get, to the best summer camp that will prepare them for the best schools. It's very different, and it was a real surprise in making 112 Weddings to see how much children impacted the marriages. That it was sort of the centerpiece of almost every marriage, for good or for bad. Whether they were healthy or in one or two cases, had real health issues. So that was really interesting and unexpected. But it's also, it was very interesting to me how, once I started interviewing the couples, how, I don't know, it's almost as if they mistook me for a therapist. That they had this real, they really got into talking about it as if they hadn't really talked much about their relationship to each other. And I know that's not necessarily true, but maybe it was the kinds of questions that I was asking. It's kind of rare for somebody to come in and ask you, what did you go into marriage expecting it would be, and what did it turn out to be? Those are pretty simple questions, but it's sort of stunning to think about and to talk about, and to get into in a deep way, and particularly when somebody's listening very closely and the two of them are together, and they might not have talked about things like that. So even the silences and pauses were very dramatic and revealing.
Tell me about the D word.
The D Word is an online community and discussion forum for documentary filmmakers from all over the world. It's free. It's run by volunteers. It's now in its 16th year. We have over 13,000 members from 128 countries, and we've never promoted it or advertised it, or it's all grown out of word of mouth. So it's just, and it's also, as proud as I am of my films, I think my proudest accomplishment by far, because it's just been, it's stunning to me on an everyday basis to go on and see these really amazing conversations and expressions of support and help coming from all over the globe every day. And friendships and working partnerships that have, so many have been struck up through this. I can't begin to tell you, and it's very gratifying, and it's pretty ironic because it came out as a direct result of making Homepage, the film about the personal bloggers, and where it evolved through following Justin's story that he became involved in an online community site that was a startup. I got very interested in the idea of online communities back, in doing the film, and Justin, you could say encouraged me or goaded me into creating my own online diary at the time, which it is actually a scene in the film. You see me creating it with him, and in the moment called it the D Word. Partly, as a reference to documentary, but also because it was going to be my online diary, D for Doug as well as documentary. And I kept that up for almost 4 years during the making and then distribution of Homepage. And I got very tired of, at the end of, getting up on my soapbox and, spewing out whatever it was, which when you get into distribution of films, it's hard to be really candid about what's going on behind the scenes there. And I just got into a conversation one day with a friend who also was very involved in virtual communities and said, they're not really, I said something offhand like, documentary filmmakers would make such a great, online community. They're so generous and helpful, and, they're out to do good in the world, and they're, very giving and supportive, and God knows they need it. And he said, "Oh, it's not that hard to do. We would get it set up for maybe a few $100. And the next day we had it up. The next day, it was the official launch day of the D Word, and that was like, what was it, September 1st, 1999, and here we are."
Wow. And I don't think it's not just they're not just documentary directors, and I think when people think of documentaries, I mean, they see that. For instance, you on a lot of your films, you work as the director and the producer and the writer, and you operate the camera. But a lot of people have the impression that all documentary filmmaking must just be kind of a one-man gig. But there are lots of other kind of team members that come into play, whether it be producers or you mentioned an editor earlier. Mm-hmm. And I want to follow up on the editor aspect of it.
Yeah.
How important is it, after you've been so intensely invested in capturing this footage, to have an outside perspective, an outside set of eyes, kind of put it all together?
Well, for me, it's critical. Not every documentary filmmaker uses another, an editor. Often they'll do their own editing, and that's fine. Some are great at it. Ross McElwee did his own editing for years. Alan Berliner, for instance, does his own editing. He's a spectacular editor. Because mine are so story-driven, and because they are so intensely personal, and also because I love the process of collaborating, and I don't get to do that on the shoots because I work as a one-person crew. The times I've been hired to do film, directing, it's such a luxury for me to work with a crew when I'm shooting, but it's pretty rare. But editing is where I get to collaborate, not just with my editor, and the last two films is with a fantastic editor, Maeve O'Boyle, but also with my producing partner, Laurie Cheadle, who I've worked with now on 4 films, and who's also a real creative partner, so we'll sit together and we'll, look at cuts, and so, we're endlessly talking about what's not there as well as what's there, or what's not working, or the editing process is it's kind of a weirdly negative place in a way, because all you're doing is fixing a problem. You're fixing something that's not working, like a scene that isn't working. You make it work, and then it's like, okay, that's now on to the next thing that's not working. It's problem solving, and it's fun. You could say that, I guess, about a crossword puzzle. But it's working on one big. I liken it more to a jigsaw puzzle. And you're putting all the pieces together to make it into a picture that works as a picture, and you have a frame around the outside, and you have pieces that clearly go together, but you don't know quite within that frame where they go until you start working on the other pieces, and slowly over time, you start seeing not just where the pieces go, but maybe what's missing in between the pieces that will connect them. Maybe a scene you haven't shot yet, or an interview you haven't done. So it's a huge challenge, and it's great fun. I love that end of the filmmaking process, far more than anything, I think.
There's also the willingness to throw out the pieces that don't fit. Even particular scenes or footage that you're married to, there has to be kind of a merciless quality to editing.
Yep. and that's where it's where a really good editor that you trust comes in, helps so often. But I found with my editors, I've worked with 3 now on my 5 films. Debbie Rosenberg was on my first 2, and you tend to work with people. You don't hire them unless you kind of think in a like-minded way about story. And despite all their different temperaments, we were always in sync about what worked and what didn't work in a story. I can't remember a time when I ever fought with them over a scene, or it might have been a line of narration that I liked that they didn't, or vice versa, or it would come down to some small thing that we would work out. And but I can't even remember a time in any of the films where we had any kind of major disagreements over what worked and what didn't work. We'd almost always be laughing at the same lines in an interview, or in a scene. Humor was always sort of the great connector. I've built entire scenes out of just because it made us laugh when we first saw it in the editing room. I think it's that important, particularly in documentaries. But yeah, it's it's to me the biggest collaboration in the filmmaking process. For other documentary filmmakers, it's often if they don't shoot themselves, it's with the cinematographer, the DP, because that's where you're getting the footage that you need to begin with, and there's all sorts of discussions and dialogue and debate that goes on there. For me, it's just an internal one.
Well, my last question for you, and you've mentioned at least one of the titles already in Sherman's March, but if you were to recommend a few films for people that want to know what the documentary form, what it's capable of, outside of your own resume, which films would you recommend to them?
Are you talking historically, or are you talking current?
Any titles if you were to teach a documentary.
I don't know. There's so many great ones, and I'm making a film now about personal documentary filmmaking. So they've been on my brain in the last year or so, and I've been watching a lot of or rewatching a lot of great personal documentaries. So I'm a little bit in that mode these days, but I love Stories We Tell, Sarah Polley's documentary from last year or the year before. I thought that was just an amazing film. I was hugely impressed re-seeing Tarnation, which is maybe 10 years old, Jonathan Coet's film. Astonishing film. Alan Berliner's films just constantly amaze me. I think he's one of the great artists in filmmaking, much less documentary filmmaking, and never gets enough credit as far as I'm concerned. But I love documentaries in general. I loved Man on Wire, for instance. That was just a fantastic film. I like the one, I'm already forgetting its name, Searching for Sugar Man.
Yes, yeah.
But I go back to things like The Thin Blue Line was an influential one. I loved Roger and Me, Michael Moore's first film, which was also a huge... The Maisels? I remember seeing Gimme Shelter when it first came out and thinking, wow, that's a powerful film. That was before I even liked documentaries much. That predated Sherman's March by a long time. But all of Ross's films, Ross McElway's films, have been a big influence on me. Not just Sherman's March, but Time Indefinite was, incredible film, and influenced me greatly in the in terms of memory and time as being a subject for film, and how didn't even have to have a really vivid story, that it could be almost kind of a Shaggy Dog story, or almost like an essay type of documentary, and still be completely fascinating. Wow, I'm
You've named quite a
sure
few.
I'm forgetting an awful lot of them, but there are many that are like I could go back to The War Game. Do you remember that from the 60s? There was like a simulation of what would happen if there were a nuclear attack, I think in Great Britain. And it scared the shit out of me. I remember when I saw it. I didn't even consider it a documentary because it's like was reenactments and stuff. It felt like a fiction film, much like one of my very favorite fiction films, The Battle of Algiers. Feels like a documentary when you're watching it.
Yeah.
There's it gets back to your question from the beginning about is this a new trend, the entertainment value of documentary? I'd say it is, but there's still some amazing documentaries. From the early years, to Nanook of the North, that are that I would probably see now with very new eyes if I were to watch them again. But I would say a real tipping point was Bowling for Columbine and Fahrenheit 9/11, the Michael Moore films. I mean, they just put documentary in the stratosphere for a while, and
big time.
Suddenly, I think what happened was the industry started looking at documentary a different way. I called my the D word was named in part as kind of tongue-in-cheek way that the industry used to refer to documentaries as the D word. They loved them, but you can't market them. Nobody will come see them, and that was very much the attitude in '99. Actually it was '96 when I named it, but '99 when it took off as a community. Those two films by Michael Moore really changed that. It's been a kind of up and down roller coaster ride ever since. It goes in cycles where documentaries are doing well again at the box office and are getting picked up by distributors, and then a period where they go, I don't know, there's a retrenchment. So. Now there's a whole thing about whether people are even willing to come out and see documentaries in theaters, and whether they're going online or what.
A lot of narrative filmmakers are obviously facing that same. I saw months ago. I saw an interview with Kevin Bacon, and he said, this is Kevin Bacon. He said, I haven't had a movie out in the theaters for a while, so they've just gone on demand. But God bless the new technology, because in places like HBO, because they give a home to so many great documentaries that otherwise might not have been seen by the masses.
It's a really interesting time. We used to think as filmmakers that theatrical distribution was the end-all, be-all, goal. Mm-hmm. And it just isn't anymore. People aren't coming to see it. If you want anybody under 40 to see your film, they're not going to do it by paying to see it in a theater unless it's at a film festival. I am very, very, thankful to have I had my last 4 films on HBO, but the last one, 112 Weddings, we bypassed theatrical for the first time. We didn't fight for it. We didn't, I just felt like it was a losing proposition, and I learned the hard way on The Kids Grow Up when we worked every bit as hard with 51 Birch Street. It got, almost as uniformly great reviews. It had even more press and publicity behind it, and people just didn't come out. They came out for 51 Birch Street for whatever reasons. They came out for that, but they, 4 years later, did not come out for The Kids Grow Up. But when I told people that, particularly parents, anybody who had kids, and that was kind of a core audience for The Kids Grow Up. When I'd say it's coming to a theater, it had like, oh, that's great. When I said it was going to be on HBO, then they would go like, oh my God, really, HBO? When? And I after like the 10th person reacted that way, I went, maybe getting into theaters isn't quite what it's made out to be. And then, you open up the New York Times every Friday and 25 new films are being reviewed, a third of them documentaries. Have no money to get anybody into the theater. It's kind of heartbreaking. So things are changing. The economics are changing, and and yet whether it goes on to straight to telephone, I'm still going to bring to it the same sensibility that I had when I grew up and saw movies in a movie theater. I still think of people watching my film in that way, and I guess as long as there are film festivals, and that's how a great number of people will see my films. I still think of them that way.
Mm-hmm.
The curtain, the lights going out, the curtain party. It's just you and your film and your audience. Whether it's one person, 500 people, you better show them the goods.
Yeah, I don't think that it's necessarily changed what we respond to in the form. It's just changed the way in which it is delivered.
Way it's delivered and way it's received. Maybe people watch it watch their films like they read books now. 5 minutes at a time before they go to sleep.
Wow.
They fall asleep over your mother, talking about complaining about you as a child. Who knows?
Well, that's a comforting thought.